Senator.
On the issue of the minister's answer on the Indigenous Advancement Strategy and in answer to the question from Senator McLucas.
Yep, okay, that's what's before us.
I'd like to take note of that answer and express my disappointment at the minister's response on that answer. He clearly has not been listening to the Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities in terms of their response to the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. In fact, they weren't consulted in the first place. And I urge him to re-look at Commissioner Gooder's Social Justice and Native Title Report of 2010, where very clearly Mr Gooder points out that it was a year characterised by deep funding cuts, radical reshaping of existing programs and services and the development of new programs and services. Information on the transfer arrangements has been scant, with minimal involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There was little or no consultation on with those working on the ground about which programs and activities were best kept or which departments were best placed to administer them. Overall, he says, this upheaval and lack of clarity is deeply worrying and is causing widespread uncertainty and stress, particularly amongst our communities. Now, Mr Gooder has been out throughout the year talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and this is his findings. How can we believe the minister when the commissioner charged with social justice and working on these issues finds that overall this upheaval and lack of clarity is deeply worrying and is causing widespread uncertainty and stress, particularly amongst Aboriginal communities? I must admit that absolutely reflects the feedback that I have been out when I have been out and about talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I have not been to as many communities as the Commissioner has, but certainly that is the feedback. And who can blame them for feeling like that when you've had 5,000 applications? When in estimates the department's response, we think we've had around 3,000, we haven't opened them all yet. They couldn't tell us how many submissions they had, they couldn't tell us what they were for or the amount of money they were for. Since then, they've subsequently discovered that there's actually 5,000. And I don't think that they are going to be able to meet even the extension that they have granted themselves. Organisations that rely on this funding are deeply worried about the future, their future, but that is only really a symptom of their deep worry, which is how services are going to be provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. This government is leading people up the garden path if they think that they are not going to be taking funding away from frontline services and that communities won't realise that their services have been cut. We have a Prime Minister for Aboriginal Affairs who's overseeing a mess in terms when it comes to delivery of services and programs. As Commissioner Gooder said, the radical reshaping of existing programs and services. He is overseeing a mess, because that's what it's looking like to people on the ground. It absolutely looks like it on the ground. If it walks and talks and quacks like a duck, it is a duck, and that is what's happening with this strategy. It is a duck. People are deeply worried about the future of their communities. On top of this process, what do we see? We're seeing that Premier Barnett in Western Australia announced that he's going to close up to 150 communities. And that is also as a direct response to the fact that there is not enough funding coming in to support those communities. And have the governments, state and federal, thought through what happens to those people when they are effectively kicked out of their communities? They end up being homeless, they end up on the outskirts of town, they end up living in far worse situations than they have left, meaning that services have to go further to provide the support that people need. Commissioner Gooder goes on to say it is disappointing that savings from the rationalisation of Indigenous programs and services will not be reinvested in Indigenous affairs and closing the gap initiatives, once again highlighting the failure of this government to provide the necessary services and support from a Prime Minister who says he's the Prime Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. But then, of course, you've got the Minister for Indigenous Affairs and you've got the Parliamentary Secretary. Nobody really knows what's going on in the mess that this government is currently making of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs.
Thank you, Senator Siewert. The question is the